All right. So Jess asked me to talk about culture. I can talk about culture at the drop of a hat. It's really turned out to be probably my primary professional interest in my career, largely because I was lucky enough to come to Regeneron. And I hope you'll notice that we talk a lot about culture at Regeneron because we believe, and it was probably one of the big insights of my career because people talked about Regeneron culture when I was recruited to come here. People talked about what a great culture it was, but nobody had ever really figured out what the culture was. And I think we figured out as a company that our culture is a strategic advantage, which is why we focus so much on it. If you, this is my view, you can form your own view, but if you look at what distinguishes Regeneron and what's Regeneron's real strategic advantage, I think it's the ability to do certain things that we deem are important with great quality faster than anybody else can do them. So we've got all the Velasas, and that's obvious. But we also can build a sales force, as some of you know. We can build a sales force probably faster than anybody. One of our capabilities in HR is the ability to hire in large numbers with quality fast because we need that as a growth company. And we can do clinical development when we decide that that's what we need to focus on faster, I think, than most companies can do. And when you look at how do we do that, it's not because we have great processes. Some of you haven't been here long enough to understand that we don't have great processes, but we're not a process-driven company by any stretch. And it's not because we use technology better than anybody else, because at best we're average, and I suspect we're not even average in our use of technology. But the reason we're able to do so many things faster is because we ask our employees to dig deep, and they do it. Okay, so anybody who's been at Regeneron for any period of time understands that what's typical is we have some unreasonable thing that we decide we're going to do. We need to launch a drug, and we're going to do a sales force, and oh, by the way, we want everybody to go to Dallas and live there for 3 months so we can hire our sales force. And people do it. And then we decide, they come back, we throw a party, and then we say, we got another one for you. We need to launch whatever it is. And people do it. And they do it because they believe in Regeneron. They care about what they do. They care about the company. And they're willing to repeatedly dig deep without getting burnt out, because we worry about burnout, and it really doesn't happen. And there are people that have been digging deep for 27, 28 years here who still aren't burnt out because they believe in what they're doing. They believe in the company. They care. They want to be part of this. And that's where the culture comes in. Okay? So we talk a lot about retaining certain things of the culture. And my argument would be, if we lose those things, we lose our edge. If we lose highly engaged employees, we become maybe just like everybody else, but it's probably worse than that, because we're probably not as good as everybody else, again, because our processes aren't that great, our systems aren't that great, but we're motivated. You lose the motivation and the engagement, we probably lose our edge, okay? So culture's a big deal. We don't just talk about it because it's a nice, fluffy thing. And frankly, one of the nicest things for me in being gone for a couple of years and then coming back was, at one point I felt like I was the only person talking about culture. And then I came back and everybody's talking about culture, which is really nice. So I was there for the hiring of, I was here for the hiring of the Praluent sales force. And Bob Terafe talked about culture, and David Robinson talked about culture, and George Yankopoulos talks about culture, and other people talk about culture. So it's for real here. It's not just some pretty thing that we do. So let me give you some history. I was hired in July of 2002. And just before, while I was trying to figure out, do I want to come to this dinky little company, there was an article in the New York Times where they interviewed Len and George, and they did a little blurb in the business section in the Sunday Times on Regeneron. And this is a quote. These are quotes from Len, and this is little Regeneron. This is not successful Regeneron. And look at the chutzpah, the audaciousness of the things that Len and Roy were talking about. And this is a company where at the time that Len was saying this, at the time that George was saying this, Regeneron's market cap was a couple $100 million. We had 600 employees. We had 0 sales and no prospect of sales. We had 0 revenues and no prospect of revenues. We had 0 marketed products and no prospects of, well, actually, we had a product that looked like, when I came, that looked like it was going to be big, and it failed a couple of months later. But at the time of this, we had no marketed products. We had 0 successes. Not one thing had worked in Regeneron's 15 years or so at that point. And we'd had 1 big failure, about to have a second failure a couple months later here. Yet there you have Len Schleifer talking about being bigger than, and you have Roy Vagelos talking about the inevitable success of this company, and nobody believed it but Regeneron people. But it's classic Regeneron. So when we talk about culture at Regeneron, we talk about, I'm going to talk about the Regeneron 5 in a minute or two. But what we're really talking about isn't holding on to everything, and it's not trying to be the same company we were in 1988 or the same company we were in 2002. It's identifying the things that we think distinguish us from other companies and working really hard to keep those things while everything else changes. I mean, that's really what our strategy is around culture. Keep the things that are most important while everything else changes. So we don't wake up one day and we're just like Pfizer, or we're just like Novartis, or we're just like Biogen or whatever, okay? So that's when we talk about retain the culture, retain the culture, retain the culture. We're not talking about staying stagnant. Everything, and you've seen anybody who's been here a year or two, everything is changing at Regeneron, except we hope 5 things, okay? So I'm going to talk about the Regeneron 5. There was no Regeneron 5. There was a culture, but there was no defined culture, and there was no Regeneron 5 until 2007, excuse me. And have any of you worked in big companies at all? Okay, some of you have, and they have their values up on the wall and that sort of stuff. Had I wanted to do that, and I came out of big companies and I was pretty cynical about those things, but had I wanted to do mission, vision, values, and that sort of thing at Regeneron, I couldn't have gotten any of the senior management to do it. It was just too big pharma, okay? But we, in 2007, we were finally getting ready to grow a little bit. As soon as I got here, we had a failure. We hunkered down. We did almost no hiring. 2007, we were finally getting ready to hire. I had brought in a guy named George Renton, who some of you know, to be the head of staffing. And George had said to me, we need to do some employment branding. No one knows who Regeneron is. And we didn't have any good materials. We didn't have anything good at all till we brought George in, who's good. And we brought in some people to do employment branding, and they ended up touching in one way or another virtually every employee in Regeneron, either through interviews, focus groups, or surveys. And even though it wasn't a deliverable, they came to me at one point with a handwritten list, and it had 5 things on it. And they said to me, this is the strongest culture we have ever encountered, no matter who we speak with, whether it's Len Schleifer or the guy who sweeps the floors in Rensselaer. Everybody talks about these 5 things. And it became the Regeneron 5. This is one of the slides they did. They asked, in the focus groups, they asked people, this was 2007, to talk about, if you had to talk about Regeneron in one word, what would that word be? And this is kind of a summary. And you can see a lot of the things are absolutely the same, positives and negatives. You notice there's frustrating in there and some other things. But this is what it's like. But the 5 things that they pointed out became the Regeneron 5, and this is how they became the Regeneron 5. This project coincided with the signing of the first Sanofi antibody deal, which happened in late October, early November of 2007. And that was really the turning point for Regeneron, because we knew at that point we were going to grow a lot, because frankly Sanofi was paying us a lot of money to grow. And we knew we would have the resources to get drugs over the line then. And I happened to be in a meeting, and George said to Len, I hope as we grow, we don't lose the things that made Regeneron, that we don't lose the distinctiveness that has made us successful. And I had that piece of paper that had those 5 things written on them, and I passed it around, and everybody went, yeah, that's it. And we literally decided then that these were the 5 things we wanted to keep. In a way that isn't at all typical of Regeneron, the senior management really got into this, and these were essentially written by the senior management of the company. Generally, frankly, the way things work here, Len would have said, you do, this is your thing, you do it. But they were so engaged with getting these things down in a way that would be meaningful that virtually every one of these was written by, mainly by a particular senior manager. This was Neil Stahl, and it's classic Neil Stahl. And Neil agonized over the words on that. I think this was me, because it's certain. No, excuse me. This was Murray Goldberg. Where am I? That's the way we've always done it. If that wasn't me, I believe it was me at this point. But this really resonated with the senior people. So what's important about it? Let's go back to the things that were on the wall in the company that you worked in. The way those things work, those mission, vision, value things, is you bring in a consultant. The consultant takes the senior management off for a day and a half. They talk about what they would like the company to be. Generally, they're so disengaged from what the company truly is that they end up with something that frankly sounds like every other value statement in every other company in the world. And they bring them back, and they do a big rollout, and they put them on the walls in all the meeting rooms. And as soon as the senior management walks away, the employees roll their eyeballs and go, right. That's not what this is. This was our employees telling us what they liked about the company, and us saying, you know what, they got it right. This is the heart of the company. Let's keep this stuff. So very, very different from what you would typically say. And this is not an aspiration. This is what our employees told us we had. And our strategy isn't to change to become this. Our strategy is to try to hold on to this amidst really wrenching change. Okay? Very, very challenging, but not nearly as hard as changing your culture. So hard as this is, I'd rather be here trying to keep these 5 things than be at Pfizer trying to change that thing into something that works better. Okay? So that's the Regeneron 5. So what do we try to do with this stuff? What we did, I think, quite well, and I think we're building that capability again, is we decided that the best way to keep the culture, now remember, we were a few hundred employees, and we knew we were embarking on fairly significant growth, 35 to 50% compounded, year after year. And we decided one of the best ways to keep this culture is to go out and find people who want to be in a culture like this. So rather than bring people in who don't want to be part of this, we decided that what we could do is go get the best people from other companies who feel that something is missing from the place that they worked in. And that was very much our strategy. So we used these things. We had marketing campaigns. I have a bunch of slides I'm not going to show you. But we had marketing campaigns built around the whole notion of coming here and being part of a culture that you can't get in these other companies. And frankly, we cleaned other companies' clocks. We had people lining up, particularly scientists, who wanted to be in a place like this. And we use the Regeneron 5 or the culture also as a way of retaining people. Our assumption is if we can keep these things, it's more likely that people will stay with us because they enjoy what they're doing. They're not as frustrated as they are in other places. And so far so good. So we use these things. Part of what we want people to recognize really from the day they walk into interview is they're not in Kansas anymore. I hope you're not so young that your parents didn't make you watch Wizard of Oz, so you know what I mean when I say that? Okay, so we purposely try to be different. And one of the things that I was watching out for very carefully when I came back was, had we been homogenized like everybody else? Were we starting to look like, feel like, talk like every other company? One of the things that was striking to me when we would have candidates in is they would say, I've never seen so many happy people. Because frankly, if you haven't worked in another company, while I can show you some unhappy Regeneron people, there are lots of people who are just dragging themselves into work every day. And we do things to, I'll talk about this in a minute. We do things to make it clear that you're not in Kansas anymore. I mean, we are sometimes purposefully weird. We'll talk a little bit about that. And we're constantly trying to think of things that will distinguish us from everybody else, okay? So part of, I never wrote these things down until I got ready to leave the first time, but there was method to our madness from the HR function. So these are the things that we did as a function and we pushed as a function to try to distinguish ourselves from other places. And again, you can see from this the emphasis on culture. We really, as I said, we believe it's a strategic advantage. We focus on it, we measure it, we survey on it, we talk about it, we try to make it real, probably more than most places. A lot of what the person in my job needs to do is that second bullet. It's to try to find ways, because if all we do is talk about it, it's nonsense. So it's to try to find ways and constantly find ways to make it tangible, to demonstrate to people that we're not like everybody else, and to, frankly, to demonstrate that we are what we say we are. And so, it's in silly ways, it's the ice cream truck, and it's some of the other things. But we also go out of our way to try to, and this is very, very unusual in a modern company. We talk about loyalty. If you go to a big company, you've been told not to ever talk about loyalty. Because if you talk about loyalty, it implies, and I heard this lecture in several big companies, if you talk about loyalty, then you're implying some sort of relationship with your company, and maybe someone will sue you because they think you guaranteed them a job for life. It was total nonsense in the 1980s. It was total nonsense in the 1990s. It's still in big companies, and it's baloney. And in our case, to the extent that a company can be loyal to employees, can care about its employees, we try to do that. We do it within the limits that companies have. So, we don't guarantee that we'll never let people go. We've done 2 layoffs in Regeneron's almost 30 years, one during my time, one in 1994. If we had to do it again, we would do it. We do it compassionately, we do it well, as we did. But unlike most companies now, it's the last thing we would think of, not the second thing we would think of. Okay, I was at Novartis. We let people go every quarter. Every time the financial results came out, I would get a call from Switzerland, and we would let people go. Pfizer lets them go 10,000 at a time. It's really destructive. If you've been, hopefully you won't go through that. But if you've been in a big company that's constantly laying people off, the organization never settles down. And luckily for us, and I wasn't here, but the layoff in 1994, when the company almost went out of business, was so emotionally painful to the people who were here that they never wanted to do it again. And that's a really healthy lesson. And as I said, we did one in 2005 when I was here because we were running out of money. We lost a couple of collaborations, or a couple collaborations ended that were paying for a number of people, and we did it. But again, we did it very, very reluctantly, and we try to manage the company in a way that we don't have to do it again, okay? But we also, some of the things that I just loved about being here was, and no one ever told me to do it, but I always knew, and I always know, that I can do the right thing if it needs to be done. So there were a couple of times, just to give you an example, there were a couple of times where we just had a bad run, and we had a couple of fairly low-paid employees who passed away suddenly. And both times, somehow it got to me through the grapevine that the family didn't have money for the funerals. And without asking anybody, we wrote a check, we couriered it to the families, and we paid for the funeral. And after that, I told Len what I did, and both times Len said the same thing to me, which was good. But I didn't have to ask. I didn't have to go to the policy manual where you get if you make an exception from one employee, it's some of the dumb bureaucratic stuff that you do in big companies that really is illogical. But here we have the ability to do the right thing. We didn't do that so employees would say, hey, what a great place. But word gets around, and obviously it's symbolic of the way we see things. Another good story, there was, I used to go up to Rensselaer all the time when I first was in the company. And there was a young woman who was, again, organizationally at a pretty low level in the company. And she had a severely disabled daughter. And she stopped me, and she had read somewhere that one of our board members, one of the Nobel Prize winners, had an expertise in something, and she asked if she could contact the board member. And I talked to Len about it. Len said, I'll call her. Len called her, made arrangements for her to get in to see one of the really, really good specialists in New York City. And he handled it himself, not because he was trying to exemplify the culture, but because that's the kind of place we are. And there are many, many stories like that you probably wouldn't hear in other companies that are very much Regeneron, okay? And the external brand drives internal perception. One of our other insights was it's just fine for us to talk about what a great place we are, which I do all the time, but it means more if somebody else is telling you how great you are. So we, in a way that was fairly calculated, decided that we wanted to play in the world and we wanted others to recognize how good we are. So if you get an email from me, you always get all these best places things. Everything has logos. All the HR people have it, because it frankly reinforces the message, and it means more if someone else tells you how good you are than it does if you pat yourself on the back. We nurture a sense of specialness at Regeneron. We want people to, go back to that first slide about Regeneron's going to be bigger than Genentech. We want people to feel like they're in a special place. We think very highly of ourselves. We have high self-esteem at Regeneron, and we want people to swagger a little bit. Some of the fun of being, and I'm not a swaggerer by nature, but it's kind of fun at Regeneron to think you're better than everybody else. And even when we weren't, we thought we were. And now that we are, you know, it's fun to swagger a little bit, so feel free to swagger. And we also want to stay true to our roots. My favorite word for Regeneron when we did that Regeneron in a word was quirky. You know, we are not a corporate kind of place. We don't want to be a corporate kind of place. There's all kinds of pressures as you get bigger to get more and more corporate. And I'll add one of my big contributions that I was proud of is I resurrected Cheesy Hawaiian Shirt Day when it died, because I thought it was so emblematic of Regeneron, and that we could do such a weird thing. Has anybody seen Neil Stahl this week? He dresses like my little brother who's a surfer. You know, you don't do that at Pfizer. I was up the other day and he had on his Hawaiian shirt, he had his shorts on. We got to keep some of the weirdness as we get bigger and bigger and bigger, and it gets harder. But I've never been anywhere where your CEO has in his office the life-size portrait of him on his surfboard, which we had in the lobby at one point, okay? So that's just kind of a thumbnail. I could do this for an hour or two, and there's lots more examples. But I guess if I want you to take something away, it's that notion of culture as a strategic advantage. I mean, it's not a strategic advantage in every company. Frankly, it's a strategic disadvantage in lots of companies. But we really have something special here that I believe has allowed us to do a lot of the things that have made us successful, and frankly, we lose it at our peril, which is why I get to come and rant about culture and bureaucracy and things like that. Okay, I'm going to stop. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about anything, frankly, but or I'll just go eat ice cream. Questions? Arguments?